At the exact moment when we need community the most, which is when we have small children, when we're raising children, that's when we isolate ourselves into these nuclear family homes. So this is a talk that's derived from my most recent book, Everyday Utopia, in praise of radical alternatives to the traditional family home. So I want to talk about some 21st century challenges that we are collectively facing today. The first and probably most obvious is the climate crisis. The fact that we've just lived through the hottest summer on record, and there are going to be more extreme climate events, presumably in the future, is one of the challenges that we are currently facing. Another is severe levels of inequality. So this is a little graph. It shows the distribution of global wealth in 2013. This is a little dated, it's from 10 years ago, but it's incredibly unevenly distributed. And in the United States, which is where I come from, this is even worse. So it turns out that when this graph was done here in, I think this was 2021, 71% of wealth is held by the top 10% of the population. So this is an extremely growing crisis. And as a result of this crisis, and partially contributing to this crisis, are high levels of social isolation and loneliness. So we have really interesting data. This is from 2018, before the pandemic, all right? So if you look at these numbers here, 22% of Americans, 23% of Britons say that they are often or always lonely. That's 1 in 5 people, and this is before the pandemic, all right? You can also see that an advanced industrialized country like Japan has far lower rates of loneliness and social isolation. And of course, this is much worse if you are a lower income person, if you have a mental health condition or a debilitating condition. We also have a crisis of care. We have a crisis of care for the young. We have a crisis of care for the elderly. It's becoming increasingly difficult to raise children. Many young people are deciding not to start families because of the costs associated with starting a family, and also the housing crisis. I was just on a panel on the housing crisis. The cost of housing makes it very difficult to begin a family. And then we also have the elder care crisis. So graying populations, what the New York Times calls kinless seniors, people who don't have children, who don't have partners. What is going to happen to these people? So the basic argument of my book is that our model of the nuclear family, where 2 adults provide relatively exclusive biparental care to their own biological offspring in a single family home, surrounded by their own privately owned stuff, is a big part of the problem, okay? So now I know this sounds very unconventional, but trust me, my solution to this problem, what I'm going to propose today, is not all that radical. If you've ever been to university and you've ever lived in a dormitory, you have experienced communal living. In my country, when people go to college, they often call it the best 4 years of their lives, right? And part of the reason is because they lived in a community where they shared resources, where they shared meals with other people, where everything was in walking distance. And it's a sort of form of communal living, interestingly, that actually grows out of monastic living. I'll talk about that later. In my country also, after you turn 55, we have these things called over 55 communities. We have senior living communities, assisted living facilities. Basically, these are just posh dorms, right? They're fancier. They have a little bit more in the terms of amenities, but people still generally kind of eat together. They have socializing that's built in. They have a lot of common spaces that they share. So the irony, if you ask me, is that at the exact moment when we need community the most, which is when we have small children, when we're raising children and educating children, that's when we isolate ourselves into these nuclear family homes. So in early part of our lives, we might live communally. Even if you don't go to university, you have a flat share in your 20s, you've experienced this. At the end of our lives, we might move into a senior living community. But in this middle crucial part, we tend to desire the single family box. So Thinking outside the single family box is a way to solve some of these problems that I highlighted at the beginning of my presentation. So the first question is, can the return of communal living, more communal forms of living, reduce our carbon footprints? So I can just tell you yes, but I'm actually going to argue that there is empirical evidence. We have very, very good empirical evidence that shows that communal living reduces carbon footprints, but not while sacrificing quality of life or personal well-being. So we have a couple of great studies starting as early as 2005 that talk about the ways in which what are called intentional versus unintentional communities help people live more happily, socially, in nature, while reducing consumption. This concluding remarks of this study is it is possible to achieve a high and probably more sustainable quality of life while consuming at rates much less than the US average. And part of what this study does is to look at this kind of basket of what is called built human, social, and natural capital. Built capital being economic capital, and then social and human capital, and natural capital being other types of capital that people accumulate. We also have a study from 2017, the quality of life in intentional communities. This also very clearly shows that intentional community inhabitants report well-being on par with the highest scores previously published. The findings support the contention that sustainability in the form of a communal lifestyle of low ecological footprint may be promoted without forfeiting well-being. In 2020, this is very recent, there was a big scoping review of the effects of co-housing. Now, co-housing, I'm going to talk about in a second, is sort of a less communal form. It's sort of a middle ground between the full intentional community and maybe an extended family household. And it's very clear here that people's mental health and well-being are improved by living in these more communal forms of housing. The data to date, the evidence suggests that co-housing decreases isolation in seniors, positively impacts inhabitants' quality of life, and benefits physical and mental health. Among intergenerational housing residents, co-housing also increased mutual support and created a sense of community among residents. So this is a slide, a graphic from the Center for Research into Energy and Demand Solutions. It was published here by the BBC. And it's very clear that in terms of our personal carbon footprints, our homes are one of the biggest generators of carbon. And yet when the BBC decides, right, to print this graphic to talk about the ways in which we can individually reduce our carbon footprints, you know, by living car-free or eating a vegan diet or taking one less long-haul flight, one of the things that they don't really talk about is our housing, other than in the form of refurbishment and renovation, maybe install a heat pump, but never, instead of heating 2 homes, why not just heat 1 home with 2 people in it? Right? This just seems really obvious. And yet, for most of us, when we think about the climate crisis, we don't think about changing the way we organize our domestic lives in order to deal with some of these crises that I'm talking about. So I see your faces and you're thinking, objection! This will never work because it's completely unnatural. We are wired to want privacy. We are wired to want to be alone in our walls. And what my book does is basically lay out 2,500 years of social experiments that show us a variety of viable alternatives. Now, I only have 30 minutes, so I'm not going to go through 2,500 years of experiments here, but I'm going to give you just a little bit of a taste of what I'm talking about in the book. So the first, where I start, is way before 2,500 years ago. I go 9,000 years ago to Neolithic Çatalhöyük, which is today in contemporary Turkey. And the thing about Çatalhöyük, which is fascinating, is that this archaeological site has been excavated. It's built at a time where humans were just kind of on the cusp of agriculture. And people in Çatalhöyük lived in one big mega dwelling. And the way you got into your house was there was a hole in the roof and there was a ladder, and you would go into the house from the roof down through the ladder, and the roofs of this big mega city basically were a big communal living room where everybody interacted socially with each other. Now here's the most fascinating thing about Çatalhöyük. archaeologists discovered that in these individual dwellings, there are bones buried under the hearth. And now, with the technology that we have with archaeogenetics, they can actually take those bones and try to determine who these people were. So, what did archaeologists assume? Archaeologists assumed that people who were in turn buried here at the same time were blood-related kin. Guess what? They weren't, right? So, these results could be interpreted to suggest that inclusion for internment within a home was only minimally related to biological affinity. Instead, the site might have been organized by an alternative definition of kin that was not defined in terms of genetic relationships. So our very definition of family didn't apply at this particular period of time. And so what I do is to say, okay, let's go back in history and look at all these different social movements, utopian movements that decided that a group of people that were going to live together in a non-consanguineous group, so not blood-related people. And one of the most interesting is the Pythagoreans. So many of you may know Pythagoras as the triangle guy, right? He's, taught in every middle school when you do geometry, right? But what you don't learn is that Pythagoras was the great-great-grandfather of utopian thinking. He started a commune. He left mainland Greece with a group of his followers and settled what is now southern Italy in a village called Croton. And they basically lived together. They shared all their resources in common. They had a saying, I'm going to totally butcher the ancient Greek here, koineta naphilon, which means among friends, all things in common. They also treated women as equals, which is fascinating. The world's first known named female mathematician, Theano, was a Pythagorean. And we know from the 3rd century philosopher Iamblichus that the Pythagorean way of life influenced Plato. When Plato was writing the Republic, his ideal city of Callipolis was based very much on what Plato understood to be the Pythagorean way of living. And you can see here that Pythagoras really wanted to rethink the family structure, as did Plato. So Plato wanted to free his guardians, and this is a quote from Book 5 of the Republic, from the sort of faction that the possession of property, children, and families cause among people. If the guardians acquire private land, houses, and money themselves, they will be household managers and farmers instead of guardians, hostile masters to other citizens instead of their allies. That's Book 3. Outside of the Western tradition, the first cenobidic monastics were early Buddhists in the 5th century BC. Cenobidic monastic are a group of monastics that live together as opposed to eremitic monastics, which are people who live by themselves, hermits. So cenobidic monasticism begins with the early Buddhists. There's also some really interesting evidence about a group called the Essenes in Judea, which existed between the 2nd century and the 1st century AD. They also lived communally. They also shared their property. Interestingly, they refused to hold slaves because they believed in the principle of self-labor. And some of them, we know, were celibates, but they took in children, unwanted children, children who were often abandoned, and they raised them collectively. We also know that the Bible, this is, again, little known facts here, Acts 2 clearly shows that the early followers of Christ basically lived in a commune. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. And in case you didn't get the message the first time, it's repeated in Acts 4. The believers share their possessions. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. From time to time, those who owned land and houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Now, these passages in the Bible are really important to the creation of Christian cenobidic monasticism in the Eastern Roman Empire in the 3rd century AD, which then comes to Europe. It is brought by a guy called Saint Benedict of Nursia, who writes the Rule of Saint Benedict in 530 AD, which is a text that quotes Acts and is basically an outline for how a bunch of non-blood-related people could live together in a community, together in harmony with each other and with nature. And this 6th century text then inspires many, many different Christian monastic traditions that are with us up into the present day.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.